The snow under their boots changed as they approached the saddle. Back on the approach, it had been a mix of crust and powder, each step a crunch that you could almost fall into a rhythm with. Hey, the snow turned glassy and shallow. Wind had scoured it down to a hard, uneven layer that squeaked and slipped underweight, hiding rock just beneath the white. Kara felt the difference through the soles of her boots before she fully registered the narrowing of the terrain. The flanks of the mountains eased inward, the ridges on either side rising higher, closer, like the walls of a throat. The sky above pinched, a band of blue framed by gray rock. "Keep it moving," Reyes called, glancing back over his shoulder. His breath streamed in white trails. "This is the choke. Don't bunch up. Watch your spacing." The team stretched through the saddle like a living chain. Reyes near the front, signal specialist a few men back, Kara offset to the left, scanning the slopes. The medic walked near the middle, his aid bag a dense bulge on his back. Behind them, the listening station had already shrunk to a dot on the ridge. The radios had behaved on the way up. Enough. Reyes had made periodic checks with the outpost, each time reassured by the clipped, routine exchanges. Status normal. ETA on extraction. Weather updates. The last call had been scratchier, a faint hiss riding under the words, but still there. Now, as they filed into the low point, something in the air changed. Kara didn't hear it so much as she felt it, the way a room feels different before someone says something terrible. The wind dropped for a heartbeat, bringing a deceptive stillness. The usual ambient creaks and sighs of gear and clothing seemed to pull back. She looked up, sweeping from left ridge to right. White and gray. Wind picking up plumes of snow along the tops. Nothing obvious. Nothing that screamed ambush beyond the fact that this was the exact kind of spot you'd pick if you wanted to hammer a patrol into the ground. The first sound wasn't a shot. It was a dull, distant thump. Too heavy to be a rifle. Too far to be one of their grenades. Highs snapped uphill. "Hold," Reyes said automatically, raising his fist. The team froze as well as any human train in an exposed gap could. Boots slipped, shoulders bumped, breath caught. The second sound came a half-second later, the muted crump of something detonating high on the slope to their right. A geyser of snow leapt into the air, a graceful white fountain that hung for a breathless moment before collapsing. It was too far away to be danger. It was close enough to be a warning. "Test round," Kara said under her breath. "What was that?" one of the younger operators asked, his voice rising. "Mortar," the medic said grimly. "They are walking it in." Reyes's head snapped left, then right, eyes scanning for muzzle flashes. "Everybody low," he ordered. "Weapons up. Find whatever cover you can. Move." The second round landed closer. This one through snow and rock, punching a dainty gray bloom into the air just beyond their column. The sound hit them a beat later, a slap that bounced between the ridges. Then, as if that was the cue they'd all been waiting for, the world erupted. Rifles cracked from the left ridge, a volley of well-timed shots that tore through the upper part of the saddle. At least one machine gun opened on full burst from the right, its heavy, chopping roar unmistakable. Traces flicked through the air in arcs of molten green and red, biting into snow and stone. "Contact right and left. Get down, get down." Reyes roared, but half the men were already throwing themselves toward what little cover existed. Shallow dips, jagged rocks barely big enough to hide behind. Kara hit the ground hard, shoulders slamming into the crust. She rolled into the nearest depression, snow punching into her collar. Her rifle clanged against a buried stone, and she instinctively pulled it against her chest as if shielding it from the world. She listened. The machine gun on the right was disciplined, short, mean bursts, not the wild spray of a panicked shooter. Someone was calling corrections. The rifles on the left ridge worked in a pattern too, filling the gaps, forcing heads down when the machine gun paused to reload or cool. A round struck a rock near the front of the column and ricocheted, whining past someone's ear. "I'm hit," a voice cried, raw and sharp. "Cole." The medic, Brooks, didn't hesitate. He broke from his spot and slid across the snow, a grunt of pain escaping as a bullet snapped close enough to tug at his sleeve. He reached Cole and yanked him sideways, dragging him into the scant shadow of a rock outcrop. Blood already spread across Cole's chest, a dark stain soaking into the front of his plate carrier and down into the snow beneath him. Brooks cursed under his breath, gloved fingers tearing at straps. "Pressure here," he shouted at the nearest operator, who shoved his rifle aside long enough to lean his weight into a wad of bandage over the wound. Kara pressed her cheek into the cold and lifted her head just enough to see. The terrain was officially terrible. The saddle's lowest point was barely knee-deep from the surrounding lip. The rocks scattered across it were old, broken things, their edges rounded by centuries of weather. They offered concealment, not cover. A bullet wouldn't care much about the difference. The ridges on either side were taller up close than they'd looked from the outpost. To the left, a steep slope studded with outcrops, perfect for riflemen to fire down without exposing more than an elbow. To the right, a slightly gentler incline that led to a shelf of rock. And above that, the sheer face of solid ice and granite. The third mortar round landed just uphill from their center, showering them with snow and stone. No one screamed this time. That almost made it worse. Reyes ducked his head against the shower, then jammed his hand against the radio on his shoulder. "Outpost. This is Alpha 1-1. Troops in contact. Grid." Static answered him, a wall of angry white noise that climbed right into his teeth. He twisted the dial, switched frequencies. "Any station. This net. This is Alpha 1-1. We are." Another burst of machine gun fire scrubbed the air. He could hear fragments. Noise floor just spiked. "You unreadable. Say again." And then nothing. "Comms are trash," the signal specialist called from where he was hunkered behind a rock no bigger than a suitcase. "They're jamming us." "That's not terrain. That's active." "Of course they are," Kara thought. They were never the only ones listening. "Switch to alternate. Short range only, if you can get it," Reyes shouted. "Hand signals if you can't. Preston, put rounds on that gun. Keep its head down for Brooks." The operator to the right dug his elbows in and returned fire, sending tight bursts up the slope, aiming at the vague muzzle flashes he could see when the machine gun spoke. The enemy didn't flinch. Their fire stayed measured, precise. Someone up there was in control, playing them like pieces on a board. Kara slid forward in her little hollow, scooping snow out with her gloved hand to deepen it just enough for her chest and rifle. She rolled onto her side, then back, bringing the rifle up, muzzle nudging over the lip of snow. Through the scope, the chaos of the saddle compressed into a movie without sound. She panned across the left ridge first, catching quick glimpses of movement. An arm here, a hard shadow there, each one tagged in her mind as rifle, near threat. She marked them, but didn't fire yet. Then she swung right. From here, the machine gun position was visible only in slices, hidden behind a fold in the slope. She could see the sharp flicker of muzzle blast, the vague shape of a man hunched behind a tripod. The rest was implied, a team, a few spare barrel cases, more ammunition than she wanted to think about. Her reticle drifted higher. The sheer face above it was almost beautiful in its brutality. Ice clung to the rock in thick tongues, tinted blue in the shadows. Snow had collected in shelves and cornices that jutted out like the jaws of some frozen predator. Behind one such overhang, deeper into the face, something lurked. She saw the shimmer again. It wavered in the scope, a mirage in the thin air. Not ambient, not random, a distort in the way light moved along a curved piece of manufactured glass. A viewport or ballistic shield. Beside it, she could just make out the blunt outline of a boxy device, half buried in snow, cables snaking down into rock. There you are. Another rifle cracked to her left, a shot aimed at her muzzle flash. The bullet hit just below her position, showering her with snow. "Down! Hold!" Preston yelled. "They are bracketing you." She exhaled, letting the tension drip out through her fingers instead of her muscles. The knee threats could kill them in minutes. The thing behind the cornice could decide whether anyone ever knew they died here at all. She slid her left hand up to the side of the rifle and lifted 2 fingers into the air, signaling to Reyes without looking away from the glass. "Overwatch element," she called loudly enough for him to hear. Halfway up the right face, behind the cornice. gun shield, and something ugly that's smoking our radios. Reyes crawled toward her until he could get a sliver of the view she had. He risked a quick glance, following the line of a barrel. He saw the shimmer, the faint suggestion of metal. The cables. His stomach dropped. Distance, he asked. Kara ran the calculation in the back of her mind. Angle. Scale of the rock she could see. Difference in apparent size between near and far features. She came up with a number that would have looked reasonable on a range card and ridiculous anywhere else. Too far, Reyes answered himself before she had to. He shook his head, jaw tight. Angle's bad. Wind's all over the place in this slot. You be shooting up through turbulent air, and we've got rounds snapping our eyebrows off. Another mortar hit the skip just above them, stepping down the slope. Snow roared past in a white curtain. Baruch shouted something about needing more pressure on the wound. Cole groaned. Reyes looked at the medic, then back at the shimmer, then down at Kara. He saw calm, not arrogance, in her eyes. A kind of cold focus he both respected and distrusted, because he didn't fully understand it. No one can make that shot, he said, the words tasting like ice on his tongue. He meant it. He meant it as fact, as assessment. He meant it as a way of forcing his mind away from miracles and toward the grim work of keeping people alive in the next 30 seconds. The phrase slipped out to the others too, carried on the team net and the air between them. No one can. Kara let it pass over her the way she let wind blow over her body when she was steadying a position. She didn't flinch. Her eye stayed on the ridge. Outside the scope, there was screaming and gunfire and the irregular percussion of incoming rounds. Inside it, there were numbers and shapes. The gun shield, the faint hint of a helmet behind it, the cable that led down from the box into rock, the angle of the icicle hanging just beside the cornice, pointing like a crude arrow. Her left hand pressed deeper into the snow, fingers spread, feeling for the wind. Even at this low vantage, she could sense eddies, the way gusts curled around the rocks, the way fine powder lifted and drifted. She imagined what that would be like higher up, where the face met the open sky. It would shear and twist, but it would also have patterns. "Halt!" Reyes snapped, as another round cut the air just above her helmet. I said, "Sir," she said, eyes still glued to the glass. "If they keep that jamming up, nobody knows we're dying here until they find our bodies and that drive is gone." He stared at her. She could feel it. "I don't need a clean shot," she added. "I just need a chance to get one." A mortar round landed closer, this time low in the bowl, the blast slapping them with a wave of overpressure that made her teeth ache. Baruch swore as a spray of gravel cut his cheek, bright red against the gray day. Cole made a thin, animal noise. Reyes's gaze flicked between the wounded man and the ridge. "We wait," he thought. "We hold. We ride it out. They run out of ammo on nerve." Air responder punches through the jamming somehow. Something changes. But nothing ever changed on its own. Another burst from the machine gun chewed the rock just inches above Brooks's back. He flattened himself, pressing his hands harder into Cole's chest. "Halt! Knee threats," Reyes insisted, even as his voice betrayed doubt. "Keep them off us. We hold here. They don't rush. They want us alive. That buys time." "They are not rushing because they are not done shaping the fight," she said. "They are fixing us in the open so they can send in a capture team once we're too tired and too low on ammo to fight back. That nest up there is driving the whole thing." Her mind flashed, unbidden, to the rooftop years ago. Different country, different weather. A boy standing too close to a man with a rifle. The man had been the target. The boy had moved at the wrong time. The commander had yelled, "Shoot." She had seen the boy's face and said no. Shot or no shot, people had died. And after, when it was all tallied up, the report had said she'd refused a lawful order. It had said her hesitation had cost lives. No mention of the kid. The paperwork didn't know what to do with boys with eyes too big for their faces. Up here, there were no bystanders. Just professionals on both sides, all of them having made different choices. Reyes cursed under his breath. The sounds of the battle crowded in. He could hear the steady, calm cadence of the enemy's fire, the careful tightening of the mortar bracket. He could hear Brooks's exertion, the small, rasping breaths of a man who knew he was losing blood faster than he could replace it. He could feel the cheapness of the phrase "no one can" in his mouth. "Even if you try, it's a suicide play," he said. "They see you set up for that angle, they'll tear you apart." She blinked once, a slow, deliberate thing. "Then I don't set up here," she said. He frowned. "What?" "This is the worst place to take that shot from," she went on. "I'm low, I'm in their known engagement area, and I'm shooting through the worst slice of wind in this valley. I need altitude and a different line." "And where exactly are you going to get that?" Reyes demanded. "We're in a bull, halt." She pulled back from the scope just long enough to glance to their left. A narrow, snow-drifted shelf hugged the base of the right-hand ridge, half hidden behind a scatter of rocks. It wound along the contour, leading toward an area where the sheer face stepped out slightly before dropping again. "Up there," she said simply. "I take that shelf, hug it, climb to a ledge and shoot down into their position from an angle they're not expecting." Reyes stared at the shelf. It was narrow. It was exposed to anyone on the left ridge. The thought of someone trying to climb the face above it made his stomach ring hollow. "That's not in any playbook I've ever seen," he said. "Neither is sitting in the middle of a prepared kill zone waiting to get collected on a truck," she replied. Another mortar hit, closer still. Snow fell over them in a thick sheet, blurring everything for a second. When it cleared, Reyes saw a new red patch on someone's sleeve farther down the line. Another hit. Another problem. The medic shouted for help, his voice fraying around the edges. "Safe is an illusion," a voice in Reyes's head said. It sounded a lot like an old instructor's. He looked back at Cora. "You step off that line. I can't protect you," he said. "I can't cover you. I can't send anyone after you if it goes sideways. You'll be on your own." "I know," she said. "If you fall, you don't get a second try." "I know that too." He searched her face for something. Panic, bravado, a crack. There was nothing but the same quiet focus that had made him uneasy in the briefing. "Time?" she asked. "What?" He jolted at the abruptness of it. "How long before you have to move this whole unit or get overrun?" she said. "Best estimate." He looked at the bowl, the way the mortars were walking in, the rate of fire from the ridges. The enemy hadn't closed yet, but he could sense the radius tightening, like netting slowly drawn around trapped fish. 10 minutes, he said. "Honestly, maybe 15 if we push it. After that, they have us boxed and tired and bleeding, and we start making bad decisions." She nodded once. "Give me 10, she said. "If you don't hear from me by then, do what you have to do." He wanted to say no. The words sat at the back of his throat like a stone. But so did the image of that shimmering nest, and the knowledge that even if they miraculously fought off the first wave, as long as that jammer was alive, they were fighting blind and alone. Reyes swore in a language that felt older than the war. "Go," he said. "Take only what you need. Keep radio on guard. If you get up there and it's a no-go, you don't be a martyr. You break contact and find a way back, or you stay alive somewhere they can't find you. You hear me?" She met his eyes. "I hear you." 10 minutes, he repeated. He put his hand on her shoulder for a second. Not an order, not a blessing, just contact. "Make them count." She pulled back into her shallow trench and began to strip down her world. She unbuckled the extra pouches on her belt, shedding anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Extra food, a spare field dressing, anything bulky, including a small metal flask she'd carried for years as a talisman more than a container. It went into the snow beside her. Lighter, lighter, lighter. Rifle, obviously. 3 full magazines on her rig and 1 in the gun. 1 more tucked in a chest pocket where cold fingers could reach it without fumbling. A compact backup sight, offset and zeroed for closer work. A short coil of rope with a simple harness already tied for hasty belay. A carabiner. A small, battered handheld radio dialed to the alternate short-range frequency, clipped where she could talk into it without taking her eyes off the world. She checked each item once, twice. Her motions were economical, practiced. Fear threaded through them, but it had nowhere to go. It was something to keep tethered, not something to indulge. Preston leaned closer, keeping his body between her and the left ridge as best he could. "You're really going to do this?" he asked, breath harsh. "We're already in the bad idea," she said. "This is just a different flavor." "You want a buddy?" he asked. It wasn't bravado, it was habit. No one liked the idea of someone stepping into something alone. "If I take someone else, I double what they have to track," she said. "And I slow down. Watch my line instead. If I start taking fire from the left, that means they've seen me. Make them regret paying attention to me instead of you." He let out a breath that might have been a humorless laugh. "Copy that." Brooke shouted for more pressure on Cole's wound. Kara looked once in their direction. Blood and white and gray, all feathered together. The medic was in full autopilot. Pack wound, check airway, manage shock. He had his own impossible math to run, and no clean solutions. She couldn't help him from here. Kara dug her toes into the snow, gathered her legs under her like a sprinter, and waited for the rhythm of the enemy fire. Machine gun on the right, 3 bursts. Rifles on the left, staggered. A mortar thumped further back. She counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3. On the 3, the machine gun paused, either cooling or adjusting. The rifles on the left had just completed their ripple. She went. She exploded out of her shallow trench, body low, rifle cradled tight across her chest. Snow kicked up around her boots as she sprinted for the edge of the bowl, angling toward the narrow shelf she'd picked out. Shouts erupted from her own team's line, some of them warnings, others ragged cheers. The enemy needed a heartbeat to process the sudden movement that wasn't staying low and small like everything else. Then the slopes lit up with new streaks of tracers, searching for her. She felt the air tee past her ears, the way bullets slapped at the world when they missed. One darted so close to her calf she could feel its passing as a line of heat under the layers of fabric. She hit the relative shelter of the rocks at the bowl's edge and slid hard, one knee slamming into unforgiving stone. Pain flared up her leg, bright and hot. She didn't stop. She folded herself into the space between boulders and sucked in a breath that felt like swallowing knives. Reyes watched her from his position, jaw clenched. She made the first dash. The shelf was still ahead, a narrow, snow-loaded path that hugged the ridge, with a drop of unknown depth on the outward side. "Move! Halt!" he whispered, as if she could hear him. "Move!" Kara forced her breathing back under control. The enemy fire had already shifted slightly, a portion of it now probing the rock she sheltered behind instead of the bowl. It was an imperfect trade, but it meant a fraction less violence centered on her team. She crawled sideways until she reached the lip of the shelf. From up close, it looked worse. The path was barely a meter wide in places, a smooth curve of compacted snow with a rock wall on her left and open air on her right. Where the shelf narrowed, ice glistened through the surface, slick and unforgiving. A misstep here wouldn't mean a stumble. It would mean a fall, and a long time to think on the way down. She tested the first step with her boot, feeling for purchase. The snow compressed under her weight, but held. She shifted her center of gravity toward the rock, letting her shoulders scrape along it as she eased out onto the shelf. The sound of the battle dropped by a notch. The bowl behind her became a slightly muffled echo, the ridges funneling the noise away in different patterns. Wind became louder, or maybe she just noticed it more. She moved. Each step was a negotiation. Some sections were covered in wind-packed snow that gave just enough friction. Others were polished with ice, requiring her to plant her boot carefully and test it before committing weight. Twice, rock bulged outward, forcing her to lean over the drop on her right to get around it. Each time, her stomach roiled, but her legs did what she told them to. The snow squall that had been threatening all morning chose that moment to arrive. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a thickening of the air, a slight blurring of edges. Then the wind shifted hard, slamming into the ridge and bouncing back in chaotic gusts that drove needle-fine flakes into her exposed skin. Visibility dropped. The world shrank to a gray-white tunnel with the rock at her left as the only solid reference. "Perfect timing," she muttered. A few hundred meters behind her, in the bowl, a mortar round landed close enough to send a tremor through the rock under her feet. She stumbled, hand slapping flat against the cold stone, shoulder scraping. Snow slid under her boot, and for a second she felt her weight tilt toward the empty space to her right. Her throat tightened. She threw all her weight back into the wall and froze until the subtle slither of snow over the edge slowed and stopped. Her radio crackled faintly at her shoulder. "Halt, status." Reyes's voice, broken by interference, reached her through bursts of static. She keyed the transmit button. "Still moving," she panted. "Shelf is sporty. How's your world?" "Louder," he replied. "Mortars closer. Coal's hanging on. You've burned 3 minutes." She looked ahead along the shelf. It curved around a spur of rock before leading, she hoped, to a section where the face stepped out enough to offer a partial ledge. "Copy," she said, "trying to buy you something worth those minutes." She moved faster, trusting her instincts more. The snow squall helped, in a way. It blurred her features and made it harder for enemy spotters to see her clearly, just as it made it harder for her to see them. That cut both ways. Every step now felt like trying to cross a room with the lights out, knowing there were knives on the floor. Halfway across, a shot cracked from the left ridge. The bullet hit the rock behind her, sending a sharp ping through the stone that vibrated under her palm. She ducked purely on instinct, even though ducking on a narrow shelf with a drop was a terrible idea. "They see me," she hissed into the radio. "Then they are not shooting at us," Reyes answered. There was a savage kind of comfort in that. "Keep going." She did. At last, the shelf widened slightly as the face above her stepped out. A series of jagged fractures in the rock created a broken, uneven line upward. It wasn't a proper route. It was a suggestion of one. She craned her neck, squinting through the blowing snow. Above, maybe 20 meters up, she saw a darker smudge beneath a protruding flake of rock. A potential ledge. Not large, possibly not real, but enough. Kara unclipped her coil of rope and cinched it around her waist, tying in with practice motions. There were no bolts, no permanent anchors, just natural features. She scanned the rock and found a small horn of stone jutting out near chest level. It would never pass as a textbook anchor, but right now, it was what she had. She slung a loop of rope over it and clipped the carabiner, creating a simple point of security. It might not hold a full fall. It might slow it enough to tame certain death into broken bones and another chance. She set the rifle sling diagonally across her chest, making sure it would stay tight to her body as she moved. Then she began to climb. Her gloves scraped over wet rock, fingers searching for holds through the numbing cold. Her boots found edges, tiny shelves, imperfections. She moved with the cautious urgency of someone who knew that both speed and care had their own price. The squall thickened as she climbed. The valley fell away below her in a diffused blur. The gunfire became a more distant roar, like a storm heard from a hill miles away. She couldn't see the ball anymore, couldn't see her team. That made it both easier and harder. Easier, because she didn't have to watch them bleed while she chose where to put her next hand. Harder, because the weight of their lives pressed in from a direction she couldn't point her rifle at. Halfway up, her left boot slipped on a patch of ice. Her body lurched sideways. One hand tore free from its hold. Her shoulders slammed against the rock, sending a shock up her spine. She felt her rifle swing out for a breath before the sling snapped it back against her chest. Her optic hit the rock. Hard. There was a sickening crack, not the metallic ping of a shot, but the fragile, ugly sound of glass giving way under force. For a heartbeat, she hung there, fingers clawing for purchase, the rope going taut against her waist as it took part of her weight. Her chest heaved. The shock of impact left her seeing stars against the gray. Somewhere in the midst of that, her training clawed its way to the front. "Don't let go." Her right hand found a seam in the rock and clamped down. Her left foot flailed for a second, then jammed into a crack she could feel but not see. She repositioned her other foot, easing the pressure on the rope until it went slack again. She stayed plastered to the face, forehead pressed against stone, breathing like she'd run a mile. Her radio hissed quietly in her ear, but she didn't dare spare a hand to answer. When she could move again without shaking herself loose, she shifted enough to glance down at her rifle. The optic's objective lens was spiderwebbed with cracks. Tiny shards of glass clung in place, held by the ring of the scope, but the damage was clear. The central portion, directly over where her reticle would be, was fractured into a dozen irregular facets. Of course, she whispered hoarsely. Of course. If she had believed in signs, in omens, she might have taken that as one. Instead, she took it as just another line in the ever-growing list of things stacked against her. She forced herself upward. The last few meters were the worst, straight, less featured, requiring small dynamic moves that set the rope swinging. Her muscles burned, her forearms feeling like they were filled with molten lead. Cold had seeped through every layer, dulling sensation without taking the pain away. At last, she hooked an elbow over the edge of the ledge she'd seen from below and dragged herself up onto it. It was barely larger than a kitchen table. The rock sloped slightly outward, just enough that lying prone would feel like lying on a slide. Wind whipped across it, carrying stinging snow and a howl that seemed to come from inside the stone itself. She rolled onto it anyway, pressing her chest into the cold rock, boots digging into tiny imperfections to keep herself from sliding. "Reyes," she gasped into the radio. "I'm up." His reply came through a haze of static and distant gunfire. "See anything?" "Not yet," she said. "Stand by." She unslung the rifle and brought it up, carefully wiping blown snow off the optic's cracked glass with the edge of her glove. From this higher vantage, the valley spread below her in a new geometry. The saddle where her team lay pinned looked smaller, more fragile, like a smear of darker shapes against a white canvas. The ridges that had boxed them in now lay below her eye line. More importantly, the angle into the nest under the cornice was different. She slid forward until her chest hung over the edge of the ledge, forcing herself to trust the friction of her gear and the grip of her boots. The drop beneath her was a long, empty throat lined with rock and snow and the certainty of sudden stop. She set the bipod legs against the rock and slowly, carefully, settled the rifle into the pocket of her shoulder. Her hands were shaking. She didn't realize it until she saw the tremor in the scope, the way the world jutted and swayed. The cracked glass turned the image into something fractured and uncanny, lines of refraction bending light into odd angles. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus not on the breaks, but on the spaces between them. The reticle looked wrong, cut through with hair-thin fractures that warped its clean lines. But the center point was still there. Mostly. "You okay up there?" Reyes asked, distant thunder in her ear. She breathed. In, out, again, again. She let the rhythm soak into her muscles. The tremor eased slightly. "Define okay," she said. Her voice came out calmer than she felt. "Glass is cracked. Wind's a nightmare. Ledge is trying to throw me off. But I can see them." "Target?" he asked. She let the reticle drift across the face and found the shimmer under the cornice. From up here, she could see more. The curvature of the shield. The shape of the gun behind it. Heavy-barreled, tripod-mounted, with a gunner's helmet just barely visible above the plate. Beside the gun, half-sheltered behind a mound of snow, sat a rectangular box with cables running into the rock. A small, unassuming antenna poked up from it, disguised as a piece of dead, ice-encrusted shrub. The jammer. Below that, along the ridges, she could trace the arcs of fire. The heavy machine gun on the right slope. The cluster of rifles on the left. A figure with binoculars on a slightly higher rock, hand moving in repeated gestures she recognized as fire control. Farther back, behind a rocky fold, a group of men huddled around crates and a small folding table, a command cell. "Yeah," she said softly. "I see the target." She breathed again. Numbers ran across the surface of her mind. Range estimation wasn't perfect with her scope compromised, but she had enough reference points. She dialed elevation on the turret, fingers moving with the casual familiarity of someone who had done this thousands of times in training and dozens in anger. Wind was harder. She watched the way spindrift came off the ridges, how it twisted around certain rock features. She noted the angle of the icicles hanging from the cornice itself. She kept a thumb-felt sense of the gusts along her own ledge and tried to extrapolate. It wasn't perfect science. It never was. There was art in it too, something that lived in the skin and bones as much as in the brain. Reyes, she said quietly, tell me when you see something change. What? He asked. When their fire changes, she said. When they flinch. When they hesitate. That'll be my cue that I'm not completely crazy. He exhaled a laugh that sounded more like a cough. We've got heavy contact from the right and sporadic from the left, he reported. Mortars are, hang on, incoming. His transmission cut off for a second as a distant blast rattled her ledge. She heard muffled shouts through the static, then his voice again. Close, but we're still here. Halt, 9 minutes. She smiled without humor. Copy. Then we better get to work. She drifted the reticle back to the shimmer. The cracked glass made the edges of the shield wobble slightly, but she could still find the center mass of the gunner behind it. She settled the crosshair on a point just above where his shoulder would be. She had never forgotten the boy on the rooftop. His eyes had haunted her more than the after-action report, more than the reprimand. He had been one of the reasons she'd wondered, quietly, if this job was meant for someone who didn't think as much. But here, there were no boys. No blurred lines between combatant and civilian. The men in her scope had chosen to be here, just as she had. She took up the slack on the trigger. The world shrank down to the cracked circle of glass and the faint beating of her own heart in her ears. She exhaled and let the shot break itself. The rifle bucked into her shoulder, a solid, familiar punch. The sound rolled off the cliffs in a flat, sharp crack that sounded different from the rifles below, but only if you knew what to listen for. In the scope, despite the jolt of recoil and the fractured optics, she saw the shimmer jerk. A dark smear appeared on the inside of the shield, spattering the glass. The gunner's helmet snapped back and disappeared below the lip of the cornice. She didn't see him fall, but she saw the gun go still. At the same time, down in the saddle, the pattern of fire changed. For the first time since the ambush had started, there was a hitch. The heavy machine gun on the right mid-slope faltered, its bursts stretching longer, losing their precise timing. The rifles on the left hesitated, some of them going silent for a beat as their owners looked up, trying to understand what had just happened. She hit something. Preston shouted from the bowl, hope threading his voice. Reyes felt it too. A subtle loosening in the noose. Confirm, he called into his radio. Overwatch gunners down, Kara replied. Shields painted. They'll replace him. I've got maybe 1 or 2 shots before they figure out where I am. Make them count, he said automatically. She already was. The shield might hide whoever stepped into that spot next, but the jammer operator was more exposed. The rectangular box had a narrow combat footprint. Whoever worked it had less room to hide. She shifted slightly, adjusting her point of aim. The cracked optic refracted the image weirdly, but she found the shape of a man hunched over the device, hand on a dial, eyes on some unseen readout. She fired again. This time the recoil made her boots scrape against the rock. For a nauseating instant she felt herself slide a centimeter closer to the edge. She dug her toes in hard, calves screaming, and held. In the scope, the jammer operator jerked sideways, a flower of red blossoming on the snow beside the box. He toppled out of view, taking a tangle of cables with him. The antenna jutted as it lost its anchor, tilting at a drunken angle. Down below, Reyes's radio squawked, and for once, something resembling clarity came through. Alpha 1-1, this is Outpost. We are receiving you garbled but readable. Say again your last. Over. Reyes exhaled a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Outpost, Alpha 1-1, troops in contact, heavy, prepared ambush. Multiple casualties. Jamming present but fading. Grid as follows. He rattled off coordinates as best he could, mindful that their exact position might already have shifted under them. We are fixed in a saddle and require immediate air or indirect. Expect enemy strength platoon plus with support weapons. There was a pause. Then the voice came back, stronger now. Alpha 1-1, Outpost copies all. We are spinning up QRF and birds. Stand by for support, ETA unknown. Hold what you can. Hold what you can, Reyes thought. That's the whole game. On her ledge, Kara let herself feel a single, brief sliver of satisfaction. It wasn't joy. There was no room for that up here. But there was a certain grim pleasure in having torn a hole in the invisible wall that had cut them off from the rest of the world. She didn't get to enjoy it for long. The enemy reacted fast. Below the cornice, figures moved with renewed urgency. One man lunged toward the jammer box, trying to drag it back under better cover. Another scrambled into the gunner's position, pushing the dead body aside. Further down the slopes, squads shifted, some of them dropping lower, finding new angles that might bear on the ledge she occupied. More importantly, a small group broke away from the command cluster behind the ridge and began moving upslope, not toward the saddle, but toward the right-hand face. They were coming for her. Reyes, she reported, keeping her voice steady. They are adapting. I've got a climber element. About to start up my side of the ridge. Copy, he said. Can you engage? Not yet, she said. The angle from her ledge made it hard to see them clearly until they'd gotten higher. I need to finish the target ladder or they're going to chew you up on the way out. The what? Preston asked, breathless. Kill the eyes, kill the ears, kill the hands, then the brain, Kara said. It was how she'd been taught to think about it. Overwatch rifle, jammer, machine gun, mortar spotter, commander. You already took the eyes and ears, right? Reyes said. Gun and jammer. Gun for the Overwatch? Yes, she said. Machine gun is still working you. Jamming's crippled but not dead. They might have redundancy I can't see. As if to underline her point, her radio sputtered, then cleared again. The signal wasn't perfect, but it was there. She spotted a new problem then. On the far side of the ridgeline, near where she'd seen the command element, a small drone took off, quadrotor, compact, almost lost against the sky. It lifted, wobbling briefly in the gusty air, then steadied and began to drift out over the valley, its tiny camera searching. If it found her ledge, they wouldn't need climbers. They could call mortars straight onto her position with terrifying precision. All right, she murmured. You get to cut in line. She followed the drone back to its point of origin with her scope. The operator was easy to spot once you knew what to look for. A man hunched over a controller, face turned upward, attention locked on the machine in the sky. No one else in the cluster moved quite that way. She swung the reticle a hand's width down, found the operator's chest, and fired. The drone jerked in mid-air, its rotors spinning wildly. It careened in a drunken spiral before smacking into the side of the ridge and exploding into small, black pieces that tumbled down the slope. There goes their toy, Preston crowed, eyes wide as he watched the bits of plastic and metal fall. Nice shot, Reyes said. How's our machine gun friend doing? Annoying me, she replied. The heavy gun on the right slope had never stopped firing, though its pattern had loosened when she disrupted Overwatch. Now, it opened again with a savage intensity, trying to reassert control. The rounds it spat still chewed the rocks around the saddle, still threatened to chop anyone who broke cover into pieces. She couldn't see the gunner cleanly from her current angle. The team was tucked into a dugout behind a fold in the slope, only the muzzle and a sliver of helmet visible when they rose to fire. But she could see the man beside them. He had binoculars and a notebook. His head popped up slightly higher than the others when he looked over the lip to adjust their aim. Every time the gun burst, his hand moved, indicating corrections. Spotter. Got you, she whispered. She waited for the rhythm. Burst, pause, adjust, peak. On the next pause, his head appeared for a fraction longer as he searched for effect. She put a round through the space where his face was. The recoil slammed her shoulder again, and for a moment she lost the image behind the webbed glass. When she found it, the spotter was gone. The gunner and assistant were still there, but their fire began to wander, lacking the tight control they'd had a minute before. In the saddle, the change was immediate and visceral. The heavy rounds that had been hitting almost exactly where they needed to suddenly started chewing into less vital pieces of rock. One burst even overshot, slamming into the base of the left ridge instead of the bowl. The difference between precision and guesswork wasn't subtle when it was trying to kill you. Whatever she's doing, I like it, Brooks shouted. There was sweat in his voice despite the cold. Cole's still with us. I might actually keep him that way. Redistribute ammo, Reyes ordered, seizing the moment. If you've got more than 2 mags, you share. We might have a way out of this. The climbers on Kara's flank had made progress. They were smart, using the terrain well. They moved from cover to cover where they could, taking advantage of boulders and small ridges as they ascended. 2 advanced while 1 covered, their weapons slung but not far from hand. They were cautious, but they were coming. Kara could engage them now, but each bullet she spent on them was one she couldn't spend on the elements that were killing the rest of her team. She had to balance immediate self-preservation against the larger picture, the one where 20 people lived or died based on her prioritization. For a moment, the rooftop came back in full force. The boy's wide eyes, the man with the rifle, the order, her finger refusing to move, the aftermath, the funeral, the report. Back then, she had chosen not to fire because she hadn't been able to accept a certain cost. She'd paid in another currency instead and then kept paying quietly. In the nights after, in rooms where no one else heard, the way her jaw clenched when she remembered the sound of the shot she didn't take. Up here, she had a different calculation. If she played it safe and protected herself first, her team would likely die. If she ignored the threat climbing toward her, she might be dead before she finished her work. Neither option was comfortable. The difference was, this time, the risk fell on people who had chosen to be here, who understood the stakes. She decided. Reyes, she said, I'm going to leave your machine gunner for 60 seconds. If I'm not dead at the end of that, I'll try to take the gun offline. In that minute, you need to move. Move where? He demanded. There's a rock outcrop 50 meters north of your current position, she said, thinking of the terrain she'd memorized from the outpost. Looks like a broken tooth. If you can get to it, it'll give you better cover and a line of retreat down the backside. Use the break-in fire I've created and whatever higher can give you in the next few minutes. Copy, he said, even as doubt gnawed at him. We'll try. Don't get yourself killed. No promises, she said. She pivoted her rifle slightly, tracking the climbers. They were closer now, switching from a vertical scramble to a more angled traverse that would bring them toward the base of her ledge from below and to the side. One of them glanced up. In that moment, their eyes seemed to meet, even though the distance between them made it impossible. She saw calculation there, and a kind of grim respect. This was an opponent worth climbing for, his gaze seemed to say. Then his face disappeared behind a rock as he moved again. She waited until the leader exposed himself to reach for a higher hold. The cracked optic made it harder to be sure, but she knew the shape of a torso leaning out over space. She took a breath and let it out. The first shot took him in the shoulder. It wasn't a clean kill, but up here, gravity did most of the work after. His hand lost the hold. For a second he hung by his other arm, legs kicking at empty air. The rock he clung to crumbled under the sudden extra weight. Then he fell. He didn't scream long. The distance cut the sound down to something soft and ugly as his body bounced off the lower slope and tumbled out of sight. The second climber froze, pressed flat against the rock, instincts warring with orders. The third shouted something up at him in a language he didn't speak but had heard enough to recognize its tone. Keep moving. He did. He inched upward, trying to stay tucked into whatever cover he could find. He'd learned from his friend's mistake. He exposed less. He moved more cautiously. That slowed him down. That was what she needed. She swung back toward the machine gun. With the spotter gone, the assistant gunner had clambered up to try to both feed ammo and direct fire. The gunner was getting sloppy, but sloppiness with a weapon like that could still end people in an instant. Her angle wasn't perfect, but she could see the assistant's torso when he leaned out. She waited for the moment when his head turned toward the saddle, when his attention was on his work and not on the far ledge that was killing his friends. She shot him in the throat. Blood sprayed, a dark arc against the snow. He dropped back, hands clawing at his neck, boots kicking against the lip of the position. The gunner flinched, instinctively ducking as his partner collapsed beside him. With both their eyes disrupted, the machine gun fell mostly silent for a few critical seconds. When it did speak, the rounds went wild, traces hosing the ridge above the saddle instead of the bowl itself. Now! Reyes shouted. He surged to his feet, firing from the hip as he moved. The others followed, some limping, some supporting wounded, all of them using the sudden slackening of incoming fire to break from their fragile cover. They sprinted toward the rock outcrop she described, a jagged protrusion that angled out of the snow like a broken tooth. Enemy rifles snapped at them from the left ridge, but the sudden movement and changed angles threw off the ambush's carefully plotted lines. Shots that would have hit kneeling men behind rocks now missed running men in open snow by inches. Brooks half-carried, half-dragged Cole, the wounded operator's boots carving twin grooves in the snow. Cole's head lolled, lips pale, eyes half-lidded. Brooks cursed at him, a steady stream of low, vicious encouragement, unwilling to let him slip away. Kara tracked the movement from above, ready to pick off any enemy who showed too much of themselves in an attempt to punish the boldness. Her angle was good for that now. From here, the left ridge shooters had less cover from her line of sight. Each time one rose a bit too high to adjust fire, she sent a round in their direction. She didn't always kill. She didn't have to. For this part, suppressing was as good as eliminating. Make them afraid to stand. Make them reluctant to do their work. The second climber had made more progress than she liked. He was closer to the base of her ledge now, using features she hadn't fully appreciated from above. If he reached a certain crack, he'd be able to come up from her blind side, staying out of her scope's field of view. Once he was there, it would be a matter of who moved first, him with whatever was in his hands, or her trying to bring a long rifle to bear at close range. She took one shot at him, but the angle was bad. The bullet smacked into the rock next to his hip in a spray of stone. He flinched, then tucked himself even tighter into the shadow. "Reyes," she said, "you're clear for the next 30 seconds. Use them." "We're almost there," he panted. She could hear the strain in his voice. "Halt! We've got enemy trying to work a flank. If you've got anything left for their commander, now would be the time." She dragged her eye away from the climber and scanned for the command cluster. They were scrambling now. The drone operator was dead. The Overwatch gunner was down. The jammer operator was bleeding out beside his box. The machine gun was impaired. For all that, the enemy was still dangerous. They hadn't broken yet, but their leader was more exposed now. He stood slightly apart from the rest, yelling orders, gesturing toward both the saddle and the climbing route. His weapon hung on a sling, his hands busy directing others. He had the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, not because of rank insignia, but because of competence. He was the brain of this little beast. He would also be the turning point. She found him in the cracked glass and held him there. Wind gusted across her ledge, trying to shove the barrel sideways. She let the rifle move a hair, not fighting the gust on its strongest stroke, then brought it back when it eased. Her finger rested on the trigger, feeling the fine tremor of her own fear. He turned as she watched, yelling something toward the climber element. His hand came up in a slicing gesture, an order. She fired on the motion. The shot felt different the instant it broke, not because the recoil changed, but because something inside her eased even as everything else stayed taut. The bullet's path through the fractured optic, through turbulent, cold air, through the vast space between them. It was all a set of variables she'd done her best to tame and then had to release. In the scope, the leader's chest snapped backward. The gesture he'd been making cut off mid-slice. His body crumpled, folding into itself, then sprawling across the snow in an ungainly heap. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then chaos bloomed. Without his voice, the enemy's fire patterns fell apart. Shooters on the left ridge fired in short, uncertain bursts. The machine gun on the right stopped entirely as the surviving crew ducked and shuffled, no one quite sure who was in charge of it now. The mortar thumps in the distance stuttered, like someone had pulled the plug on the cadence. The climber beneath her froze. He looked down toward the command element, saw his leader sprawled in the snow, then looked up at her ledge with a new expression. Anger, yes. Fear, absolutely. But also something like understanding. The game had changed. In the saddle, Reyes saw the difference like a curtain being pulled aside. "Go," he shouted. "Push. That's our break." They reached the rock outcrop and piled behind it, dragging wounded with them. The outcrop provided real cover for the first time since the ambush began, a solid mass of stone that even heavy rounds would struggle to chew through. From there, a narrow defile led down the backside of the ridge, a potential escape route. Outpost, Alpha 1-1, Reyes shouted into his radio, barely able to hear his own voice over the pounding of blood in his ears. We're moving out of the saddle and attempting to break contact to the north. We've got multiple wounded. Whatever you're sending, get it here fast. Alpha 1-1, Outpost, the voice replied, clearer now. We have a QRF inbound by ground and a rotary wing package on deck awaiting clearance. Hang on, you're not alone anymore. Alone anymore? He glanced up, toward the invisible ledge where he knew his sniper lay. She had never been more alone in her life. The climber started again. His movements were more reckless now, Angus sacrificing some of the caution that had kept him alive so far. He wanted to reach her, to silence the rifle that had just decapitated his command. At the same time, fear made his hands clumsy, his feet less precise. Kara's own fear had settled into a cold knot in her chest. The shot at the commander had cost her, emotionally, physically. Her shoulder ached from the recoil. Her muscles trembled from effort and the cold. The cracked optic made every image look like a painting that had been dragged through a broken window. She had maybe 4 rounds left in her main magazine. 1 spay full mag in her pocket. 2 in the chest rig. Enough. If she didn't miss. She tried to get an angle on the climber, but he'd learned, using the terrain to keep his body out of the direct line from her ledge. He was smart. He was determined. And he was closing the last few meters fast. At the same time, enemy fire from the ridges picked up again, though less coordinated. Someone down there had rallied the shooters enough to prevent a full rout. The ambush wasn't over. It was wounded, not dead. Her mind tracked the overlapping threats like separate targets in different windows. Kill ladders in place, she thought. Eyes, ears, hands, brain. Now it's whoever's left with enough will to fight. She swapped priorities one last time. Is almost on you, isn't he? Reyes asked, catching his breath behind the rock outcrop as he checked on Brooks and Cole. Yeah, she said. Can you break contact? He asked. Climb down that backside. Find a route to us. She looked down at the sheer drop below her, the rope tied to an anchor she didn't fully trust, the snow-slick rock beneath. She imagined trying to downclimb under fire while a man with a rifle or knife or whatever else he had scrambled up to reach her. I think if I try to climb down now, she said, I'm decorating the valley floor. He was quiet for a beat. Hold. I'm not planning to die up here, sir, she said. But I'm also not going to give this guy my back. How many rounds? He asked. Enough if I'm smart, she said. Not enough if I'm stupid. He barked a short laugh despite everything. You haven't been stupid yet today. There's still time, she said dryly. Get your people out. That's the point of this. Remember. That was the point of bringing you, he said. I just didn't realize it meant this. Neither had she, if she was honest. The climber's hand appeared on the edge of a rock just below her ledge. Fingers, gloved, strong, found a crack and clenched. His other hand came up, reaching for a higher hold. She saw the top of his helmet now, the curve of it just visible over the lower lip. She slung the rifle slightly to the side and reached for the backup sight, flipping the rifle over enough to bring the small, unmagnified optic into play. The backup had been meant for closer work on more level ground, for the ugly chaos of buildings and narrow alleyways. She hadn't expected to need it on a mountain face. The red dot flickered to life. She inched forward, risking a little more of her own body over the edge, until she could bring the sight down onto the climber's helmet as he rose. He saw her then, too. Their eyes met at impossible, knife range through layers of gear and tinted lenses. For a second, the noise of the battle dropped out between them. He bared his teeth and lunged, hand reaching not for a hold, but for the ledge. She squeezed the trigger. At this distance, she couldn't miss. The rifle slammed back into her shoulder, and the man's head snapped sideways. His grip failed. His body pinwheeled away from the rock, arms and legs flailing in an almost graceful arc before gravity dragged him down. He struck a lower slope once, hard, then slid into the void beyond, vanishing into the jagged maze of rock and snow. Kara lay there, chest heaving, back up, sight still down, eyes wide behind her goggles. "You still with me?" Reyes asked, his voice tighter now, as if he'd been holding his breath. "Yeah," she said. "Climbers down. Again. Air reports 2 minutes out," he said. "They're coming in hot. Once they are overhead, you break. I don't care how you do it. You find a way off that ledge." She smiled faintly. "Roger that." The next few minutes were a blur of controlled violence. Kara went back to her cracked optic and continued to engage any enemy who tried to reassert control. She picked off a rifleman who stood too tall in an attempt to get a better angle on the escaping team. She disabled a mortar tube by hitting the man who had just dropped a round into it, causing him to fall against the weapon and knock it out of alignment. Below, Reyes led his people in a staggered withdrawal down the backside of the ridge. They moved from cover to cover, dragging wounded, laying suppressive fire whenever they could. The returning machine gun fire from the right slope smacked into the rock above them, but with the spotter and commander gone, it lacked the surgical brutality it had had at the start. The sound of rotors arrived slowly, a low rumble building into a chopping roar. Kara heard it before she saw anything. Her heart stuttered, then steadied. It wasn't magic. It didn't fix everything, but it meant someone else was in the sky now, looking down at the grid she'd helped carve with her bullets. A dark shape emerged from behind one of the more distant peaks, rotors beating the air into submission. The helicopter dipped, angling toward the valley, its nose-mounted sensors already searching. A separate, smaller buzz announced the arrival of a fixed-wing drone higher up, circling like a patient bird of prey. "Alpha 1-1, this is Hammer." A new voice crackled over Reyes's radio, crisp and somehow almost casual. "We've got your position. See multiple shooters on ridges both sides. You are danger close for any heavy ordnance. Mark your location with smoke if you can." "Copy, Hammer," Reyes said. "Green smoke on our position in 10 seconds. Anything you can do to make those ridges less angry, would appreciate." Smoke grenades arced out from behind the rock outcrop, spewing thick plumes of green that stood out starkly against the snow. The wind tried to tear the smoke apart, but there was enough of it that the helicopter could see. "Eyes on," Hammer replied. "We'll keep the high ground busy while you move. We also have eyes on a single thermal signature above the right face, near the suspected jammer location. Please confirm. Is that one of yours, or do we need to erase it?" Reyes looked up instinctively, even though he couldn't see the ledge from where he was. "That's mine," he said. "Do not erase it." There was a pause, then a low chuckle from the pilot. "Roger that. Friendly crazy person on the cliff. We'll adjust." The helicopter swung around, presenting its flank to the ridges. Its door gunner opened up with a torrent of fire, not precise, but overwhelming, sending dozens of rounds into the positions that had been so smugly safe moments before. Snow exploded. Rock chipped. Enemy shooters ducked and scrambled under the new, angry sky. Kara watched it all from above, chest heaving, fingers numb. The world that had been narrowed to the diameter of her scope expanded again, taking in the sweep of the valley, the arc of the helicopter, the trails of smoke and tracer that crisscrossed the air. She had done what she came up here to do. Now came the hardest part, leaving. The ledge that had been barely sufficient for shooting was even worse for trying to stand. Her muscles protested every attempt at movement. Her shoulder throbbed. Her fingers felt like wooden sticks. She forced them to wrap around the rifle, to sling it across her back again. She looked down at the rope she'd anchored. It was still in place, looped over the horn of stone, carabiner clipped. Whether it would hold a dynamic load was a question she preferred not to answer the hard way. She tried something else instead. The backside of the ridge wasn't a sheer drop the whole way. She'd seen, on the way up, hints of a sloping ramp of rock that curved away from the ledge and around the mountain's shoulder. If she could reach it, she might be able to scramble down without throwing all her trust into a dubious anchor. She took one last look at the valley, at the flashing lights of the helicopter rounds and the dark figures of men moving below. Then she turned her back on it and faced the rock. "Time to go," she whispered. She crabbed sideways along the ledge, keeping 3 points of contact with the rock at all times. At one point, she had to step over the rope itself, carefully lifting her boot over it without snagging. The wind gusted, trying to pry her loose, but she pressed herself closer, becoming as flat as she could. After what felt like an eternity, the ledge broadened near a corner where the mountain's face curved. Below that, she could see the beginning of the sloped ramp, a series of broken, irregular steps that descended in a rough diagonal. She unhitched herself from the rope and began to downclimb. It was clumsy. There was no art left in her movements, just dogged, grinding determination. She slid in some places more than she stepped, boots kicking small avalanches of snow and rock ahead of her. Twice she nearly lost control of her descent, catching herself with a painful wrench of her shoulder. By the time she reached the base of the ramp, her legs shook so hard she was surprised they held her weight at all. She found herself above and slightly behind where Reyes's team had been. The helicopter's presence had forced the enemy to pull back from the most exposed positions, giving her a corridor of relative safety to traverse. She moved along the rock, keeping low, until she saw them. The unit was gathered in a shallow, protected hollow behind the outcrop. Men were bandaged and bloody, but on their feet. Cole lay on a litter cobbled together from poles and straps, and full bag hanging from the end of a rifle. His eyes were half open now, blinking slowly. Reyes stood near the edge, rifle at the ready, one eye on the enemy ridges, the other on the helicopter overhead. Kara stumbled into the hollow and sagged against a rock, legs finally giving up the pretense of being reliable. Reyes turned at the movement. For a second, his mind didn't quite accept that it was her. Snow-dusted, glass cracked, eyes hollowed out by effort and something harder to name. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, like a burden he'd been carrying alone had shifted. "You alive?" he asked, because it seemed like the only question that mattered. She nodded, throat too tight for words. He walked over and crouched beside her. For a moment, they just sat there, breathing, the roar of the helicopter covering the fragile quiet between them. "You did that," he said finally, tilting his head toward the ridges that now spat only sporadic, desperate fire. "That shot. Those shots. You tore their whole plan apart." She swallowed. Her voice scraped when it came out. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "They were sloppy enough to let a goat tracker see their tool marks." He smiled faintly. "Don't undersell it. At the start, I said no one could make that shot." He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I was wrong." Kara looked down at her hands. They were scratched, bruised, filthy. They didn't look like the hands of someone who had just done something worth speeches. They looked like what they were, tools. Instruments. She thought of the rooftop again, of the shot she hadn't taken, of the file in Reyes's folder that had reduced that whole day to a paragraph and a judgment. "I didn't make one shot," she said quietly. "I made a series of bets. They paid off," he said. "Today," she said. He considered that, then nodded. "Today matters," he said. The helicopter circled overhead, then began to descend, looking for a safe spot to land or at least to drop a hoist for the most wounded. The drone stayed above, watching, recording. Later, in a hangar far from the mountains, the footage would be played on a screen. Maps would be spread across a table, annotated in red and blue. The recovered jammer components would sit in a plastic tub, tagged and bagged. Intelligence officers would trace lines from the hard drive the signal specialist had carried, drawing arrows toward other cells, other operations, other futures that might now be prevented. They would talk about the enemy's objective, how the cell had planned not just to kill a patrol, but to capture a commander and a signal specialist, to recover the intel drive, to film the whole thing for broadcast. A propaganda and intelligence coup, if it had worked. A message to everyone watching that the mountains belonged to them now. It hadn't worked. Kara would sit in the back of that room too, much as she had in the earlier briefing, hands folded, eyes quiet. This time, when someone whispered about her, the tone would be different. Reyes would stand in front of the map, hair still a little damp from the shower, bandage peeking above his collar. He would speak in the flat, unembellished cadence of the official debrief. He would describe the route, the initial contact, the jamming, the kill box. He would explain how Kara had noticed the shimmer under the cornice, how she had made the call that the saddle was a natural ambush point hours before they'd stepped into it. He would not mention the disciplinary report he'd read before all this. It seemed less relevant now. When he got to the part where he'd said, "No one can make that shot," he would pause. "I was wrong," he would say simply. "She did." The analysts would make notes. Some would nod. A few would glance over their shoulders at the quiet woman in the back and see not just a sniper, but an uncomfortable reminder that the metrics they used to judge people didn't always capture what mattered. Outside the hangar, the air would feel different. No snow, not hay, just cold tarmac, the smell of fuel, the distant rumble of generators. The mountains would be a jagged line on the horizon, still and indifferent, as if nothing significant had happened at all. Kara would stand near the edge of a training field where someone had walked earlier, leaving boot prints in the frost. Her rifle would be slung across her back, its optic wrapped in tape for now, pending replacement or repair. Reyes would join her, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the breeze. "You were right about the saddle," he'd say, "and about the tracks. The intel guys found more equipment caches up there today. They've been prepping that kill box for a while." "Not surprised," she'd say. "Good ambush takes time." "They wanted us alive," he'd add. "Best they can tell, that cell had plans to drag us off into those hills and put on a show. Would have been messy. Would have hurt more than just the people there." "Not surprised about that either," she'd say. He'd look at her then, really look. "That rooftop, in your file," he'd say. "You did what you thought was right. And you paid for it." She'd shrug slightly. "Everyone paid for it," she'd say. "That's how it works." "You know the difference between then and now?" he'd ask. She'd consider. "Sure feels colder here." He'd huff a quiet laugh. Then, "Someone told you to take a shot you couldn't live with," he'd say. "Today, no one told you to take any shot at all. I told you it couldn't be done. You went anyway." She'd be quiet for a moment. "I didn't go because you were wrong," she'd say. "I went because doing nothing would have been wise. For me." He'd nod slowly. "You ever think you might be too hard on yourself?" he'd ask. "All the time," she'd answer. "But it's kept me honest so far." They'd stand there in silence for a while, watching the new boot prints appear on the edge of the frost as another patrol walked out to do whatever the next job was. Finally, Reyes would say, "I put something in my report." "Oh," she'd say. "I said that if we're going to keep sending people into those hills, we ought to keep sending you with them," he'd say. "And that when you say a saddle looks like a kill box, we'll listen." She'd glance at him. And I said that when the next impossible shot comes around, I hope whoever's holding the rifle has half your stubbornness, he'd say. She'd let that sit in the cold air between them. On the training field, a young recruit would laugh at a joke, unaware that his world had been nudged slightly safer by a woman he hadn't met, lying on a ledge he'd never see, aiming at a target he'd never know. Kara would watch the footprints fill the frost. No trace of fire, no mortars, just the soft, ordinary imprint of boots on cold ground. She'd think of the boy on the rooftop and the man with the rifle and the choices she'd made then. She'd place that memory beside the ledge and the cornice and the shattered optic. In both stories, she had done what she could live with. The outcomes had been different. The cost had been different. But the core of her had been the same. Maybe that was enough. She'd shift her rifle on her shoulder and start walking back toward the hangar, leaving her own fresh set of prints across the white. Behind her, the mountains would stand where they had always stood, indifferent to names and files and the weight of impossible shots. Ahead of her, somewhere, there'd be another mission, another map, another red line crossing terrain that looked harmless until someone like her looked a little closer. Bravery, she was starting to realize, wasn't about believing in the shot. It was about taking it when everyone else had already decided it couldn't be done, and then living with whatever came after.